Tension gripped Kenya's capital, Nairobi, on Monday as police fired tear gas and water cannon to disperse hundreds of protesters. A Reuters reporter witnessed police open fire on a crowd of advancing protesters. One man was subsequently seen lying motionless on the road with a bloody wound. A police spokesperson did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The clashes marked the 35th anniversary of pro-democracy rallies known as Saba Saba, Swahili for 7-7, commemorating July 7, 1990, that called for a shift to multi-party democracy. Authorities locked down major roads and restricted vehicle traffic, leaving normally bustling streets deserted except for determined demonstrators on foot. Most schools and at least one shopping mall remained closed in anticipation of unrest. This year's rally follows a wave of youth-led protests in June, which began over tax hikes, but quickly widened to include anger over corruption, police violence, and the mysterious disappearances of government critics. Fatma Luyundi, one of the demonstrators, says many families are still searching for loved ones.
Going
back home is not going to help us. Our children are being abducted and killed. Parents are looking for their children, but they cannot locate them.
Our party.
Kenya's interior minister said the government was committed to protecting life and property.
It was riots, chaos, and anarchy.
Last month, Kipchumba Murkomen described the protests as, quote, terrorism disguised as dissent.
We are peaceful! We are peaceful! We are peaceful! We are peaceful!
I am an African.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Africa for Dummies podcast. My name is Nathan, as usual. I am joined by the co-host with the most, Mr. Zenge.
Hey, Nathan. Yeah, glad to be here again for a very, very pressing topic, which I think everyone across Africa has heard about by now.
Yeah. So the topic that Zenge is referring to is we're talking about the protests and resistance that is going on in Kenya. And as usual, we have a great guest, and our guest today is Mikhail Nyamweya. I know I'm butchering that. A political scientist, writer, and sharp observer of East Africa's democratic pulse. He holds a master's in African studies from the University of Oxford and focuses on everything from judicial politics to how, in this case, memes are reshaping protest culture. If you've seen the viral phrase WanTam and wondered what's really going on in Kenya's streets, Mikhail's writings has probably already explained it better than most. We're thrilled to have him on the Africa for Dummies podcast. Welcome, Mikhail.
Thank you, Nathan and Zenge, for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, so we thanks again for joining us. But we've noticed that there's another protest that is going on in Kenya, and in this time you describe humor as a rebellious way, or maybe Zenge, I don't know, maybe I should ask, what's the reason for the protest this time? Because I think the previous protest was about the economic situation. Would you say that the protest this time and the cause of this protest this time is of the same cause, or is there anything different this time?
Thank you. So in my view, personally, I believe that the protests this time around, that is in 2025, are largely because of issues that have compounded from last year. So whereas last year there were issues to do with the finance bill 2024 and so on and so forth, this time around we've started to see a recalibration of issues. For instance, subject to the protests that occurred last year, we started to see a lot of forced disappearances and kidnappings. And this was very strange because the government at that particular time sought to reassure Kenyans that nothing of the sort is going to happen and that they've listened to the youth and that they're going to address the issues very accordingly. But now, over time, we've started to see many issues compounding. For instance, aside from the forced disappearances and the kidnappings, we've also seen a heightened sense of police brutality. Police brutality in the sense that you are arrested, you're taken to custody for questioning, but nothing is heard of you subsequently. And so because of that, there's been many of these issues have compounded against rise in economic standards, rise in the cost of living, There's also been issues to do with a heightened level of unemployment, and so all of these issues came together. And one activist called out the police I think about 3 or so months ago, was taken from wherever he was, 700 kilometers away from Nairobi, and was brought to Nairobi for questioning. Once he arrived in Nairobi, he was taken to custody, but subsequently he was found dead. So the statements that the police were trying to put out was that he hit himself against the wall, he hit his head against the wall. There were so many stories, so many versions that came out from the police. But now what eventually compounded the problem and thus resulted in the first protest was the murder of that particular teacher. He was 30 years old, he's called Albert Ojwang, now late. And so because of that, that was the first protest. The second one was also to commemorate last year's protest, the finance bill, because largely the Kenyans, especially the youth, sincerely don't believe that the government is doing anything good. And I don't believe if majority of the issues were addressed then commemorating June 25th. Number one was also to celebrate the people who had passed on last year, occasioned by the protest. Number two also is that, sincerely speaking, a lot of issues could not, the protest in itself would not have reached such kind of magnitude if the government was actually listening to what the citizens are saying. So I think that chronological sequence gives you a spotlight into how the protests have compounded over time.
Oh wow, no, thanks for highlighting that in such a simplified way and then very briefly as well, and sort of the tragedies that have led to this point. But as we've seen, Kenyans are very vocal when they see things that are, they don't believe in, especially when their government is doing things that they don't believe in. However, in the article that actually led me to invite you on this podcast, you discuss a very different way in which Kenyans are rebelling, and that's using humor. So you describe humor as the rebellious way of teaching and raising awareness. Do you think Kenyans are using memes now and jokes to sort of lead to political change? Do you think memes and jokes can actually lead to long-term political change, or do they risk just being a momentary hype?
Okay, in my view, I think I could answer that question in two ways. First, is that Kenya's had a history of entertainment, comedians being on stage, especially during at the height of the Kanu regime, which was under Daniel Arap Moi, and so there were several comedians who came up around the same time and they could actually imitate the president. At the same time, we had, which is still one of the leading newspapers in Kenya, one of the leading dailies, called Daily Nation. So every week it had a section in the newspaper where a cartoon would be drawn, and I'm forgetting the name of the cartoonist himself. He passed on a bit recently. So because of that, that kind of mockery, but now people would always buy newspapers every single week just to look at that particular cartoon so that they would laugh off it. But also that in itself, at that particular time, this was in the 80s and 90s. And 80s, Kenya, like most African countries, then were undergoing a lot of political upheaval and dictatorship, which was the case also here. So because of that, and also the rise of comedians when things had started relaxing in the 90s, over time now we are starting to see like memes playing a part, because what my argument is that memes not only entertain the youth, but even people who are in their 50s and 60s, the so-called boomer generation. And so over time, Kenyans, and it's even very evident in their social media spaces, especially the Kenyan Twitter blogosphere. Kenyans are known to be very fast with banter. They are known to be very fast with jokes and creating memes. But now, in this particular context of the Gen Z protest in itself, humor at some point serves as a way to, relax the mood and to be able to laugh off, but also a way in which the youth especially are trying to, indirectly mock whatever it is that is going on in a way that is very subtle and is not censored. And so in my view, what I look at it as is that humor is more than just simply entertainment. I find it to be more of a way, because there are people who can easily, bypass a post that has, something to do with previous Pan-African scholars like, Franz Fanon and so on and so forth. But when they find a meme that has, something that is quite laughable, in that particular sense in itself, many people now start to engage with that particular content. And so when now people become very much aware of whatever is going on simply through such things. Otherwise, if someone would be very formal in terms of how these issues were being articulated, then a bit of apathy would have been seen. And so I would look at like humor in itself as more than simply a more form of entertainment in this particular context of whatever that has been going on in the last 2 years. But I would find that especially the youth have shown that they're very far from being apathetic politically, but also such kind of things also provoke how they, look at issues that pertain democratization, especially within the context of Kenya. And the beauty about this is that the memes themselves is that in many cases, like I've said, they bypass censorship. So you're not too much under government scrutiny or under scrutiny of any way, simply because it is meant to be out there for people to laugh. But also the intentions are also very different depending on who is receiving the information. But judging by how things have turned out over time, sincerely speaking, I think a good job has been done in terms of how memes and TikToks have been able to at the same time mock, but also at the same time create a sense of people to laugh.
Yeah, sorry Nathan, if I can come in. Yeah, I think you're right. The ability for people to engage with a certain context is also on how that content reaches them, and the humor aspect of it is probably very underestimated. And I think even more than entertainment, it's also a form of information, because there's a way in which humor has an ability to provide information that you would otherwise not have had. As you said, for example, if it's some philosopher from the older times, only those who are genuinely nerds in that subject would pay attention. And I think it's quite impressive the amount of civic engagement that Kenyans exhibited last year and this year. And I always complain with Nathan that I wish I could see this in Zambia as well, because not a lot of people follow each and every bill of parliament in that essence that they would even protest. It's something that you hear once it's passed and how it affects you. But I think I have a question also with regards to this momentum. There's a term in protest studies called rhizome. Is it rhizome or rhizome or something like that? It's to do with this root that doesn't really have a particular origin. So there's no leader. It's a leaderless movement. When I see the difference between these levels of protests and other protests, but so my question essentially is it lacking a leader and someone holding them down and making constructive progress. And now that we are not seeing the protest again, is there a possibility that the government has sort of shut down this thing, and how are they able to actually shut it down, the momentum and the protest against this? Have they been able to shut it down? Is this protest dying off, given the fact that there is no leader? Is it a weakness? And so this, I'm trying to see whether or not it's a weakness or a strength to have no leader and no sort of alternative to the current dispensation.
Yes, so what has been observed generally is simply the fact that number one, especially in last year's protest, because that is when we started to see a lot of vibrance, associated with the protest. Various personalities emerged, especially through social media spaces. And not only were they very vibrant in social media spaces, but they also seemed to be very vibrant in terms of leading protests, even physically in Nairobi city. And so majority of them, there were like 4 or 5 or so. I wasn't in Kenya around that time to be able to focus keenly on the population of the activists at that particular time, or rather the mouthpieces of the Gen Z. But a couple of them were arrested, occasioned by the protests. Some were taken for interrogation. Some eventually were found to, be dining with the who's and who's, the politicians. And so this aroused a very huge suspicion of that the movement itself might have been betrayed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this was actually the people who started it. It was just a conversation that was going around a lot, and what they simply did was now to crystallize the voice into one particular conversation. And so over time, there's been a very huge crackdown in alleged or suspected leaders of the movement. And while it is said that it is leaderless, in a way, I find it very organic. I find it very natural. I sincerely do not think that there are any forces or any actors that are trying to catalyze how this movement, or rather how the protests are going. And I think not many people right now want to look like they're the faces of the protest, or want to look like they're the ones who are manning the conversation or controlling the narrative, simply because of fear, because of the forced the forced disappearances, the abductions, the arrests, the murder. So I think very many of them are simply choosing to, remain mum. But whereas that is the case, we still see like a resurgence of these protests. So it clearly shows that even in the absence of particular figures, and also, there being a vacuum thereof of particular individuals or various actors, still the movement in itself remains organic regardless of who the leader is.
Yeah, and I think we're also seeing this sort of narrative, like these narratives of, because I know Ruto, I think is Kalenjin, or is that correct? Yes. So now there's a narrative that the WanTam protests are against William Ruto, and there's sort of this assumption that it's a Kikuyu thing, and then there was the hashtag, I think I am also Kikuyu. Everyone started saying they are Kikuyu because they were trying to reduce the protest to an ethnic thing. And I was also struggling for a while to understand, the grievances are things that people have complained about before. And like, they've been previous, every single president has been accused of corruption, has been accused of mysteriously killing or disappearing someone, and oppression, or buying off the media, or having lots of farms and so on. So I think his camp is very much advocating that this is just because they are trying to attack this guy because it's his tribe. All of the other presidents have had their chance at two terms rather, but this time Ruto is the guy that you do not want to have 2 terms. So why Ruto? Yeah, so I'm going to ask on behalf of those guys. Obviously, it's a narrative that's trying to reduce the legitimacy of the protest. But what is so different about this time than before? Yeah.
There's been an embattled figure in Kenyan politics of late who was the former deputy president. And the former deputy president was impeached last year in October. So in Kenya, what normally happens is that you contest for an election.
This is the Rigathi.
Yes, Rigathi Gachagua. So the running mate of the person who, eventually clinches that particular seat at the presidential level also becomes the deputy president. So what happened in this particular context is that he was aggrieved by whatever happened to him last year. So he felt that there were several factions within their party that was working towards ousting him, and on a number of accusations and allegations. So subsequently, he was like, look, the problem is not me, it's not the party, it's these particular people who are actually, creating a problem, and all these problems that we are facing right now are simply because of persons A, B, C, D, E. And so into this year now, that was I think around April or May or March, I think April or May, he was addressing a gathering, and so he was chanting this thing called so it was like William Ruto, and then the crowd and the masses start shouting WanTam, meaning a one-term president. Because what he's trying to illustrate through all of that is that, which is something that the general population believes, that many problems that you're having right now, heightened costs of living, high unemployment, rampant corruption, against all the problems that are going on right now are caused by one particular figure. And so because of that, that particular movement in itself was now informing whatever it is that is being discussed right now, that it is a Kikuyu thing. Last year now, it was that outside forces, I don't know, Western forces were the ones that were contributing to the protest.
Wait, Western forces, aren't they allies? Wasn't Ruto literally sitting in the White House last year?
Yes.
On Joe Biden's chair.
He was implying that there are forces that are coming, and he implicated a couple of organizations that are Western founded that were actually funding the protests, and many of them also seem to be coming from one particular place. So that was the narrative last year. This time round, it's more of now a tribal allegiance, and that is why it informed that thing called "We Are All Kikuyus," because in many cases, Kenyan politics has largely been dominated by ethnicity. And so political parties also in many cases are formed through ethnic coalitions. And voting also, if you look at the elections we've had since multipartyism was instated in 1992, you find that it's also towards tribal coalitions. And so because of this, also feeding into that particular narrative, these guys are still playing that old school type of politics of us versus them. So this community versus those ones. Or it's a those ones are fair and they do not want us, they want us out. Yeah. So that is simply how these issues have crystallized over time.
Yeah. And we actually did the... Yeah, no, I just wanted to add like a thought. It's not really a question. But we actually did a podcast on it in 2022 in the election. And we had thought at that time, there's this big narrative that Kenya has recovered from tribalism politics, which I think the darkest period was in 2007. I think the main justification was that Rigathi Gachagua brought Mount Kenya with him, the critical central vote-rich region, I think, that has... I don't know if it's the swing states, the so-called swing region that you'd probably give Kenya in terms of, those who they vote for often get the seat in State House. But I just wanted to throw out, it's a very interesting dynamic. And so it makes you sort of have a food for thought again and rethink whether or not indeed Kenya has recovered from this ethnic type of stirring up.
Yeah, I think just to touch on what you said, Zengi, I think for somebody who isn't really in tune with Kenyan politics, I really thought that, when President Ruto was elected, it sort of sounded like there was this new wave. He was fresh. Here's this new guy that's...
The hustler.
Yeah, here's this...
That was fun. It was a fun...
Here's this new guy.
slogan.
And also the way he was talking and the things he was talking about. It really felt like Kenya's finally making a step in the right direction, but now we're seeing these really, really bad, protests where people are dying and these sorts of things. So I wanted to ask you a bit of a personal question,
Yes.
Mikhail. If you had 30 seconds to speak directly to President Ruto and his administration, what would you say about the message behind WanTam? And what must change if the state wants to restore legitimacy?
So what I could say simply is that this isn't just noise. This is pain in the form of parody. Laughter is what's left when trust is gone, when trust has left. So listen now, or the joke will be on you.
Yeah, short and straight to the point.
Yeah. And what I would propose in general for the administration is that number one, and it's very key, is accountability. Because we've seen a lot of police killings within the past 1 year. And what I think official records could actually be saying something else, or could be recording something else. But generally speaking, the killings have been too much.
More than 100.
That kind of police. Yeah, they're more than 100, and that is on the lower side. Because there are those ones that are reported, but there are those ones that are not reported. There are some that happen because we keep hearing of disappearances every single week. So you don't know where these people are taken, whether they're alive or not. Their families are left in distraught.
Right.
So They could say 100, but it's actually more than that. On actual protests, yeah, it could be 100, give or take 100, 150.
Yeah,
Or
last
so.
year and this
But
year, I think it's 100 plus. Yep.
Yeah.
Just the protests
Yeah,
alone.
it's 100
Yeah.
plus. Yeah, and also what I think is to have a sincere dialogue that is, more humble and less patronizing,
And
because there's an assumption that
yeah, no, please go ahead.
there's an assumption that right now it's a narrative that has been created that the protesters who make up the demographic dividend of the Gen Z are people that haven't been raised very well by their parents. So when someone would stand and say that parents need to look after their kids, otherwise if they don't, the police are going to do that for them, and you know what police do. You see, so creating such kind of a narrative against people trying to have a dialogue is very patronizing, it's very condescending. But once there's a lot of humility that accompanies that kind of conversation, then I think things will start moving forward. I think another thing I would also urge is to invest more in youth-led economic solutions, because we're from a pandemic, we're recovering from a pandemic. In protests time and again.
Yep.
People graduated, majority of people who are now in the streets are people who graduated around 2019 to 2024. So these are people who graduated just around the pandemic period, or rather when the economy was recovering from the pandemic. What immediately followed the pandemic was an election. What followed the election was now the entry of this regime. What followed subsequently was the protests and everything that has been happening, rising cost of living, increased unemployment, because what I can honestly say is that this generation is the most educated in the history of Kenya.
Yeah,
It's the most educated, but also the one which has the highest unemployment rate.
yeah. Actually, I think Gen Z of Kenya, they are products essentially of the free education of Mwai Kibaki. Is that right?
Okay, that's a general assumption, but yeah, you can go with that.
Yeah. But I think what is the point? I forgot the point I was going to make. Yeah, the other point I was going to make is you speak of dialogue, and there have been dialogues before, and is it just one man or an entire system? I mean, and this is maybe a more radical example, like the Arab Spring and those things, where you remove one president, the system is still there, and they'll reproduce the same type of person after a few years. Egypt has had military dictatorship,
Yes.
and then they had democracy for 1 year, and then they went back to military sort of influenced rule. So, yeah, I'm just interested in, even if there is a next person, is it about the person or the system? And then what is the worst case scenario? Will they be a Bangladesh situation?
Yes.
Because Kenya has a reputation of being a stable country. Like, it's very hard to envision that right now. But it seems like these protests are not dying. So, you never say never. So, I don't know.
So what I believe is, so last year, occasioned by the protests, the dialogue that existed then now was between Odinga and the president. And what emerged from that was something we call the broad-based government. So broad-based government, in the sense that people from Odinga's camp would actually be represented in very influential cabinet positions. And while this was the case, there was also an ethnic dynamic attached with it. Because I think aside from maybe 2 or so cabinet secretaries, the rest who had been appointed to those positions coming from Odinga's camp were actually people belonging from his ethnic background, which was Luo. And so this left the general population under with a lot of disillusionment, because you look at, on one hand, you look at us the youth especially articulating their issues, and then the government says, okay, fine, we've had you, let us now sit and discuss what is the way forward. But now, when things are put on paper, we see that the ethnic, what you call them, a coalition of dynasties. That is what now regurgitated itself now last year, when on one hand, Odinga, who's been a key opposition figure for several years, and the president coming together, sitting, and the best thing that they could do was to create a government that is broad-based, including their own people now, putting more of their own people in government. And so the general population, like I've said, was very disillusioned. And so this over time, because we've seen that always Kenya's problems are always addressed by dialogue through this coalition of the elites. But now, unless it is local led, then because this has been a history, and if there's been a history, like you've said, in countries where there's been military dictatorship before, chances are very high that it's going to happen again. In this case, what my view is, the dialogue, if it is to happen again, in many cases you'll find, what I'm predicting is that it's still going to be a dialogue between the elites, and also their solutions are going to serve the interests of the political elites themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, my last question, I think, is a good segue into prominent people in opposition and activists. The first one that comes to mind is obviously Boniface Mwangi. I think he's the most well-known, at least from those who are not living in Kenya. And I think he was also the one arrested in Tanzania. And he was recently arrested in Kenya. Then he was released on, I think, a 1 million, I don't know if it's dollars or shillings. I think 1 million shilling bail.
That's $10,000.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's a lot of money. So do you think his arrest is going to deflect from the real issues in this mobilization around him and the prosecution of these individual figures? And then also other key opposition figures emerging, like Martha Karua, who also has traveled regionally. She's trying to also have the regional footprint. Do you think these figures will deflect from the momentum of the protest, or actually amplify it and probably provide some sort of focus points?
So what I believe is that, number one, these protests have been very unique in terms of their form and structure. Partly because many of these activists who've been at the center front for several years, about more than 10 years now, are receiving a bit of a cold reception from certain fractions of the population. So populations believe that many of them have been bought by the state, and therefore a lot of things that are happening to them, or that are seen to be happening to them, are actually being orchestrated by the state itself. That is one thing. That's the perception that the public is bearing towards a lot of activists. And so, unlike before, where a lot of protests were, opposition-led, or rather we knew the opposition would do something, or rather the civil society, or rather the activists, right now there's a lot of skepticism towards all of these non-state actors. Because we've seen a history of them being bought, and anything that is anyone who seems to be representing certain issues or articulating certain issues, in many cases are carried with a lot of skepticism and a lot of pessimism, because you don't really know whether they've been bought, or whether they've been bought, or they've been brought about just simply to, like you've said, to distract, or maybe to try and wane off any attention that is coming through the protest itself. So there's generally that disillusionment and skepticism towards these people who've known for a long time to be activists and key opposition figures.
Yeah.
I think it's I think the leaderless aspect is definitely a plus, but I think there's also a very encouraging sort of figures like Nelson Amenia. I don't know what you think about him, the guy who exposed the Adani sale, the sort of collusion, corruption style of the Kenyan Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi. I mean, if we see a lot of people like this and I think it's a huge demonstration of sort of individual sub-state agency, no main big organizations or corporations. It's just individuals working with individuals and trying to make significant changes. And we always discuss this with Nathan when we talk about, it's always these things about change and everything always gets captured by some political establishment, and then nothing really happens. But then if you look at individual laws, even independent MPs are very good at pointing those individual things and making it an issue and then fixing that thing. They might not be president, but they have avoided a very massive like sort of democratic backsliding. Yeah, Nathan, you can go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think we touched on quite a lot of things in this particular podcast. Zengi, I don't know if you're going to have any further questions because I was going to ask the final one.
Yeah, no, I think I have been completely satisfied. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
I've just gone on a train crash of
Yeah.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a really great topic, and I think really, to be honest, I think we might invite you again for another podcast to just dive deeper into some of the things. I was thinking to myself, I was like, I don't really know much about President Ruto, and it would be really nice to sort of sit down and talk to you, and just to get like a profile on who he really is and how he rose to power and etc. But basically, just to focus more on the young Kenyans we talked about that are jobless right now and have been going through the motions with COVID and protests, and it really feels hopeless and you feel powerless. What advice would you give to that young Kenyan about staying engaged without burning out?
Sure. I would simply tell them you're not powerless. Um, you're part of a generation redefining what civic action looks like. Um, Activism isn't simply just done in the streets. It's in how you speak, how you post, how you draw, how you articulate yourself, even how you dance and how you write and create. Um, I would simply tell that young Kenyan to choose their lane. Um, there are some people who go to the streets and march. There are some who work behind the scenes and meme and create memes. There are some who strategize. There are some who write. All of them are valid. Um, and also to address that particular issue of burnout. Burnout is real, but so is your brilliance. So even sometimes logging off and shutting down can also be a form of resistance.
That's really interesting, and I think, yeah, that's a really great point to end it at. Really encouraging. I think you left it at a really good note. I think I was reading a book that was talking about how um, we play a role in the actions of our society to a certain degree, you know, whether that be by indifference or whether that be by actively taking part.
Yeah.
And you're saying that by being indifferent, we actually allow for people with these negative ideas to sort of come in and fill those spaces. And so I think that's a really great point to end it at. I think to utilize the skills that you have and the power or the tools that you have on hand to sort of make people more aware and to in a way sort of be engaged. So yeah, so once again, thank you, Mikhail, for taking out the time. I know you're really busy and you're traveling and you took the time out to join us. So
Anytime.
thank you very much on behalf of our listeners, and yeah, thanks for joining us.
Anytime. You're welcome. And thank you too also.
Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
and
Yeah.
thanks to our listeners, and be sure to leave a like, share this podcast whoever would be you think would be interested, and also leave us a rating on our podcast. See you guys on the next episode.
I am an African.